Hello, and welcome to another collab review video. This time around, I'll take a quick look at the latest installment of the GungHo Collab. This will be the 4th run this year, and as usual, there will be 2 machines that you can roll in. The 6 Magic Stone machine has 28 older units in its lineup, while the 7 Magic Stone machine has 33 units, with 7 of them being completely new. Therefore, you might not have the best luck going after the new units. Thankfully, the most important unit from this GungHo Collab run can be obtained via exchange. There are some other noteworthy units in the lineup, but unless you buy bundles, I feel like you can mostly ignore those. I assume most people are very low on Magic Stones due to the recent Demon Slayer collab, and even if that's not the case, I would be very wary about rolling in this event. I feel like the main goal for most should be to only use fodder to exchange for the units that you find interesting. Therefore, if you're short on fodder from previous GungHo Collab runs, I would highly encourage you to wait for all of the free rolls and see if you even need to exchange for a unit or 2. Like previous GungHo Collab runs, the ad machine has a small chance of giving you one of the GungHo Collab 1 units. Almost all of these are useless in the current meta, but you might get lucky and get some of the few units that can actually be used as fodder, like Eclair or Laufey. Before looking at the units, I'll briefly talk about the 1.2 billion XP Colosseum, which unfortunately cannot be cheesed anymore. Well, you can still somewhat cheese that dungeon with bartender Lilin, but these themes don't have a lot of flexibility. Last time around, this dungeon didn't have enemies on execute timers, so now you don't have enough turns to charge your Suu's Abatamas or attribute changing active skills from units like Christmas Grita. Hibana is another option for those that want to farm this dungeon for XP. It doesn't have the 2x boosting leader skill that Lilin has, but some is better than none. This collab also brings a new descended dungeon that drops Drolo. He will be needed as a Sync Awakening material for Maria and Niska, the newly introduced bundle units. So make sure to farm Drolo or any of the other GungHo Collab descended bosses if you plan to use any of these units with Sync Awakening. There's one other new dungeon, Raphael Descended, which you can farm for parts to exchange for these 3 new equips. I personally don't see much value in any of these, but maybe the Raphael card can be useful on Gyome and Asanami team. This dungeon will return from time to time like Loki and Tsukuyomi Descended, and if you wanna get free stones, this event has a lot of dungeons to clear. You will also notice that most of the dungeons have been renewed since GungHo added a no assist version. Make sure to clear them to get a bunch of free stones. It is a lot to get through, so get an early start and don't leave it for the last day. There are 3 units that you can purchase with MP, though I really wouldn't look into buying Leo and Kuroyuri as these are pretty outdated units, and you might already have something better in your monster box. One thing to note is that Kuroyuri is a Sync Awakening material for a couple of units, so you might have to purchase her if you have any plans to use someone like Transforming Stella. Princess Punt and Necromancer is the MP unit of the event, meaning that when obtaining her, you will enhance the GungHo Collab badge if you have it. There are some teams that you could make that are mostly composed of GungHo Collab units, so even if you have no interest for the base or the equip, you might still want to buy this for 1 million MP. This unit has seen some use in some Rosetta and Violet Fred's teams thanks to her 45% damage reduction shield and absorption voiding active skill. If you don't have a copy yet, I would really think about getting one since that 45% damage reduction shield comes really handy at times. You could even loop 2 of her to have a looping 45% shield, though that doesn't really leave you with a lot of team flexibility. If you're short on MP and have no dark teams to use her in, I might even skip this. MP is really hard to accumulate, so do be very careful as you might be more interested in getting some of the future and returning MP units. Okay, now onto some of the REM units. As I've said, I would highly discourage you from rolling here unless you have hard and concrete plans for these units. Definitely don't roll the 6-stone machine, as almost all of the units here are effectively useless. The 7 Magic Stone REM might have a few useful units here and there, but I will also try to stay away. Though maybe some of you who like the trade fodder for Laufey for example, might decide to do a few rolls here. If you're in that situation, I would again recommend waiting until the end of the collab. I'll be taking a quick look at these units because honestly, this GungHo collab is fairly unimpressive, and the TLDR for those that have Doma is to just exchange for Laufey and get out. Out of the 6 stars from the 7-stone machine, Immoral Pursuer and Ginji might have some ranking dungeon applications due to their very interesting equips. One gives you 20 nail orbs and 1 voids damage absorption and then inflicts 1 million damage. Both have seen uses before and probably will in the future, so if you get these, maybe consider not using them as straight fodder. Vivian also has an interesting equip, though I don't think I've actually seen her being used in any ranking so far. So if you don't have Yuha, who has actually seen some use in ranking dungeons, then you might also want to keep Vivian. If you for some reason didn't pick up Kyria for your Doma team, you might be able to use the base as a cleric. It's not the worst option since she can help recover assist and also comes with a Barbaric Awakening, but do take note that her active skill can interfere with a looping shield or a looping HP buff. Our return could be another option for a Doma team. This unit is a little bit more focused on damage, though unfortunately they won't be dealing much since this is a transforming unit that doesn't cap break themselves. If you have nothing better, and if the dungeon has a lot back-to-back Awoken Binds or unmatchable debuffs, then this might not be the worst option. His equip can also be useful for some Doma subs like Gyokko, the Gyu duo, and Laufey who would rather have a water sub attribute. The delay active skill might not provide much value since on transformation, Doma also delays. At the very least, this equip also gives you 2 team HPs and a small damage boost with its cross awakening. Feeble Arthur can make up an origin system if you include 4 copies of him. The team isn't that strong, but I have seen some Evil Author teams tackle some endgame content, albeit the team won't have the damage output to reliably farm parts or have the fastest clear times. If you get him, you might make better use of the equip. It is fairly solid as it gives you decent bulk and a little bit of damage and 6 effective skill boosts. Phase Yamato is a somewhat interesting unit for light teams, though the unfortunate part is that you will need to run 2 of them to loop the 45% damage reduction shield. It might not be the worst idea, since their damage output and constant shield breaks can come pretty handy. The Chibi Evo will see some use in the future if we end up getting Shinomiya from the Kaiju No. 8 collab, as this can serve as a decent auto healer and damage absorption voider for that team. The unfortunate part is that the Chibi Evo will not be doing any damage in that team since they only need to match 1 combo, so all of Enisu's 7C Awakenings will pretty much be dead, but at the moment, this is still one of the better auto healers for that Kaiju No. 8 team. Paymon and Verne can work in Tanjiro and Nezuko teams. Paymon would serve as a cleric and take over Nezuko's role, so you'll be giving up a full cleric active skill and HP buff for a 22 billion cap rate. Sometimes you can get away with only recovering 5 turns of Awoken Bind, but getting hit with a fire or heal unmatchable debuff sounds like a very likely scenario, so in general, stick with Evo Nezuko if you can. Verne is an exchangeable 9-star that would take over Base Rengoku's role as the Fire Scaffold buffer. With this unit, you'll be giving up some more regeneration in favor of higher damage output plus an RCB buff. He will also raise fire units cap break to 15 billion. So if you're going to include him in a team, make sure to use Verne's active skill before Tanjiro and Nezuko. Otherwise, you'll overwrite their 50 billion cap rate. Verne's equip will also be really good on those fire BDP teams. At the end of the day, I do think that Paymon and Verne are slight downgrades from Evo Nezuko and Rengoku for general everyday teams, and would therefore not bother chasing or exchanging for these units if you have Tanjiro and Nezuko. Also, these units will not age that well, as Tanjiro and Nezuko will be relegated as subs for Kafka teams. So even if you want to play fire BDP teams, I don't think that these two are worth the resources. Shoko and Kalzera are exchangeable 8-stars, but I wouldn't spend the fodder on either of them. Shoko is a Rainbow TVA Piercer, which doesn't exactly offer much to any meta Rainbow teams, as these have solutions to damage void shields like Meta Ideal and Sohakuten, and the looping RCB buff is pretty lackluster by itself. At least her equip does have some use if you need to add guard break to a unit. Kalzera could be a decent HP buffer and absorption voider, though the bad part about her is that she doesn't give you any effective skill boost on transformation, and post-transformation, you will need to have some other cap breaker to take advantage of her damage awakenings. Obviously, if you use her with Verne, you might be able to make a viable fire team, but again, I don't think these units are worth the fodder, especially if you already have a Tanjiro and Nezuko team. Some of the other exchangeable 9-stars have decent awakenings and could be easier to obtain if you have a lot of GungHo Collab fodder, though at best, you might only have some use for their equipped form. That mainly goes for Arthur, Lilin, Team of 6 Young Adults, and Lakshmi and Rudra. I do think that the equips for the latter 2 units will be of more use, but I would only look into them after making any other exchanges. Princess Punt and Aviator is the collab patch unit, so if you plan to assemble a team that's mainly composed of GungHo Collab units, you might want to get this unit, though at the moment, the strongest possible team from the collab is probably Niska's, which doesn't really need the GungHo Collab patch since typically half of the units are not from this event. so you will mostly either use the 15% HP badge, the Devil badge, or even the Demon Slayer badge, since a lot of times the other half of your team are Demon Slayer units, though you might still have some use for the unit itself. For example, you could use them in an F91 team to farm the plus limit breakthrough Colosseum, though if you rolled in other recent collabs like Demon Slayer, you probably have a faster team laying around. The badge's equip is a decent one due to the skill boost, team HPs, and Power Break Awakening. It also offers 7 turns of damage absorption void, which might come in handy in some dungeon. The equip can also really shine on a rainbow parts farming team, though nobody really bothers to farm parts with rainbow units as the teams are not that fast and it's usually a little bit difficult to stack enough Power Break Awakenings to guarantee drops. Hibana and Shizune is a pretty decent looping shield that reduces damage by 40%. This is one of the few non-transforming, non-EVO active skill units with this type of shield. It is 1 turn shorter than Kyria from Demon Slayer, though the secondary effect on this unit is not as useful as the cleric effect. A Dark Skyfall buff is not in high demand at the moment since only Shinobu from Demon Slayer cares for this, and she is not a highly rated team. This unit does fit really nicely in those teams and even works as an asymmetrical pairing since the leader skill is really solid. The Chibi Evo provides a lot of utility and could deal some damage in dark PvP teams, and the active skill is really good for tanking really big hits and voiding absorption shields. Overall, I think that this duo unit is fairly solid, but is desperately lacking a home, as dark PvP teams are a bit weak at the moment. These 2 wood units could be used to assemble a wood combo team, but these can also synergize with Sanami. Base Gossil would take the cleric role, and his Chibi Evo could help boost recovery and increase Sanami Spear's uptime. The Chibi version rarely gets used though, since it doesn't bring much else to the table. The base can be a great sub if you manage to fit in a Wood Skyfall buff, since its 75% damage reduction shield can be used in newer dungeons to tank huge hits. At the moment, we don't have that many modern units, apart from Maria, who gives that type of Skyfall buff. Maria is the brand new Orb Skin unit for this GungHo Collab rerun, meaning that you can buy her for $20 if you want to skip the REM. She can serve as a leader since she has a decent leader skill that boosts eggs and part drop rate. However, farming parts will be a bit difficult without parts gravity, since mass attack leaders such as this one usually struggle killing parts before killing the main body. Maria has a good mix of utility and damage awakenings. It's unfortunate that she's not an attacker type, because if she were, she would fit in nicely in a Sanami team, since her post-transformation active skill handles attribute absorptions, which is something that team needs to cover. Usually the Sanami team runs Obanai, and if you don't have him, at least Maria will also give you a handy 4-change active skill, plus a recovery buff that should help in super altitude dungeons. You could always use an equip to turn Maria into attacker type to use with Sanami, but you will probably have to forget about her doing damage in super altitude dungeons, since at the moment we don't have any equips that attacker type, give a decent damage boost, and have a wood sub-attribute awakening. If you do want to use Maria as a leader, her leader skill will also restrict your teams to physical and healer units, which again is something that you could address via equips. But if you don't have any decent options, you probably won't be able to assemble a decent enough Maria team. Her Chibi Evo is a looping HP buffer, though this doesn't seem as broken nowadays since the other active skill effects don't really counter any other mechanics. If you already have a workable Sanami team, adding these 2 units into the mix will not open that many doors for you, so I really wouldn't bother exchanging or buying either of these units. Stella and Crowley are old BGM cards that I don't think are worth the money this time around. In the case of Stella, the base could have interesting applications in a haste system, but apart from the Corazon team, we don't really have any haste meta teams. And if you use them in non-haste teams, then their 7-turn cooldown is a little too high. The Chibi Evo does have a more than looping, roulette, and damage reduction shield. Plus, she also offers a lot of utility with her team HP awakenings and heal OE. I would say that this is still a very solid looping shield option, but most leaders nowadays rather run units from their respective REMs, either to get more stats out of the collab badges, or simply because the units synergize a lot better. And as for Crowley, you could make a fairly decent team with a lot of GungHo Collab units, though the team's damage output is not all that impressive, but is still definitely viable for some in-game content. It is interesting how Crowley now loops her cap break with only 1 copy, but I feel like 12 billion damage will quickly get power crap. And in a light combo team, you will most likely still want 2 copies of Crowley so that you can loop their orb generation, which basically renders the 2 turns of cap break a little redundant since you would be applying it every single turn. You could fit her in other teams that need a cap breaker, though I'm not really sure which units would benefit from having Crowley. Her equip is still really solid though, but I don't think that alone is worth the $30, especially because most teams might not even care all that much for the TPA Awakening. The 6 effective skill boosts, Team HP, the 7C, and the Power Break Awakening are all relatively solid, but if you have a deep box, you might have better options, especially if you need more damage, like that from a 10C or a 7C plus Awakening. Hazan and Varon are an exchangeable 9-star duo that synergizes with the new BGM, Niska, and that unit will provide the needed Light Skyfall buff to turn this duo into a 2-turn Omnivoider on a 4-turn cooldown. The base is also a common asymmetrical pairing to Niska, as the duo's leader skill gives a significant attack and recovery boost, though the latter is not that impactful since these teams rely on auto-heal effects to recover. The matching requirements for this unit remind me of Gravis, as you'll need to match 2 combos of 2 different attributes, with one of them being a TPA. This might seem like a lot of work to most, but a proper Niska team should have an easy time floating the board with light and dark orbs, which will make the leader skill activation a lot easier than Gravis's, since you will not have to worry about healing. The Chibi Evo is commonly found in Niska teams, as this is the cleric of choice due to the handy active skill that also is able to tackle shields and reduce damage by 80%. Those big shields, again, are very useful to tank big hits like those found throughout Venus. Some Niska teams don't even pair with the base form depending on the content you're tackling, but at the very least, they are most likely running the Chibi duo due to its Team HP Awakenings and active skill. And this form could be used in many different teams, though their active skill cooldown is a little bit of a concern. If you don't care for a unit's attribute or damage, you will probably be better off running someone like Pat Island, Isis, and Nephthys. Their shield is a little smaller, but it still gets the job done. Niska is decent if you care about farming rank EXP. A 1.4 EXP boost in leader skill happens to be the highest for viable meta leaders. Obviously, this is not as high as someone like Barceline's, but at least this leader is capable of handling some of the latest Emigen content with her effective HP and damage output. This unit loops a cap break effect for herself and a 40% auto heal effect, which basically means that you will not be pairing 2 Niskas together, since the other one is pretty much that weight. The 1.2 billion Colosseum that is ongoing at the moment is not mechanics heavy, so to maximize EXP, you can get away with running 2 Niskas as leaders. The only tricky part about the dungeon is stacking a lot of bulk, which is something you can easily do with a lot of GungHo Collab units in the team, since that Colosseum quintuples GungHo Collab unit stats. Outside of that dungeon, you honestly might not have much use for this leader if you have any other units like Doma, Rosetta, or Maid Ideal who still dominate the meta. PPA teams tend to have an easier time farming parts than Rainbow or other mass attack teams, but without part gravity active skills, Niska teams might actually struggle to deal enough damage to reliably farm parts in dungeons like Venus, for example. An important unit for her teams is Gyokko from Demon Slayer, who is also sometimes an asymmetrical pairing to Niska and who is also sometimes included in dupes, so that you can guarantee at least 2 light and 2 dark TPAs. If you don't have at least one of that unit, I would probably forget about this BGM unit, as light and dark TPA teams don't really have any other decent orb generators with decent damage output. In addition to orb gen, that Demon Slayer unit will also auto heal for 25% HP, meaning that with 2 Gyokkus, you'll have an instant 50% auto heal effect and then a 40% auto heal effect from Niska's active skill at the end of your turn. The Chibi Evo is able to deal with void damage shields and also boost your overall damage. Though more often than not, the typical Niska team doesn't really run this form, since Niska, Gyokko, or other common subs like Zenitsu already reliably break their own caps. I would not recommend going after a Niska team unless you have plenty of resources, really want to farm the 1.2 billion Colosseum, and have at least 1 Gyokko. I would maybe consider exchanging for Hazan and Verne if you have the fodder, as the Chibi Evo could be useful in some cases, but this shouldn't be a high priority trade. Laufey might be unable to deal as much damage as Gyokko can across 3 turns, since their cap break only lasts for 2 turns and is on a 3-turn cooldown. But I feel like the 2 turns of Pierce are definitely worth the loss in team damage output. Just like Gyokko, Laufey reapplies the Water Skyfall buff that Doma will need to auto-heal for 50% HP. That effect is essential for most dungeons, and especially so for those where enemies will void your buffs. Laufey can also have access to 2 Power Break Awakenings, which are sure to be useful in dungeons where you need to perform Power Break to either boost stats or to just guarantee the drops. Her damage output is a little on the low side, so for some dungeons, you will probably want to give up the Power Break Super Awakening in favor of the All-Stat or most likely the Cross Plus Super Awakenings to ensure that she's triple capping whenever she's cap broken. And just like Gyokko, Laufey can serve as your assist recovery unit since she has L awakenings. Not only that, but since Laufey is a non-transforming unit with a really low cooldown, you could inherit whatever you need to get your team started right at the beginning of a dungeon, as Gyokko's 2-turn haste on transformation might not exactly cut it. Thankfully, as I've been saying for the last few videos, Laufey is exchangeable, and you might already have the fodder to make the trade. Definitely look into it if you have a Doma team. I do feel like only one copy is all that you need. Her equip is not that bad for most Doma subs, but honestly this is easily replaceable. And a reminder for those that don't have a lot of fodder is to maybe wait for the very last day of the collab, as you could be lucky enough to pull some fodder from the ad machine so that you can avoid rolling as much as possible in this lackluster machine. Apart from Laufey, there really aren't that many units that I would chase or exchange for. And if you don't have Doma, you probably shouldn't even bother getting Laufey. If you buy bundles, you could purchase some units to avoid the REM, but these to me don't really seem to be worth the $20 or $30, either because I don't see that many applications for them, or because I don't see them aging all that well. Niska is a decent option if you care about farming EXP from endgame content, but you will basically need to own at least 1k Gaku and either roll or get some of the other staple subs like Hazan and Varon. Stella, Crowley, Maria, Evil Arthur, and Punt are really not worth the money. If you got them, definitely keep them, as their forms could still be of some use. Since Punt is the badge, she's also exchangeable for GungHo Collab units, but I think the only team that would care to use the GungHo Collab badge at the moment is a Crowley team, which as I've mentioned is somewhat decent, but I wouldn't expect this to age all that well. The rest of the units in the second machine are either REM only or exchangeable, but I would say that overall, most of these are not that impressive and you could even use them as fodder for Laufey. However, there are a few units that you might still want to keep. Out of the 6 stars, Genji and the Immoral Pursuer do see use from time to time in ranking dungeons due to their unique equips. Some of the 7 stars also have interesting equips, though not exactly made for rankings. Vivian's is a large button that also pierces damage voids, though I don't remember this one seeing much use in rankings as of late. Paymon's equip was this close to being great, but unfortunately, the gravity is only for 40% instead of 50%, which would allow you to deal with a lot of unit super assaults. Ariton's equip could be someone decent on some Doma subs like Gyokko and the Gyu duo who would benefit from the Water Sub-Attribute Awakening and the slight damage increase. There are better options out there like Pat Allen Clare's equip, but if you don't have a deep enough box and you free roll this guy, this could be an option for your Doma team. The base might also not be that bad for those teams for dungeons that need a really low cooldown cleric. Enisu does see some use from time to time in Shinomiya farming teams, though we don't really know if Kaiju number 8 will ever come to an A. On the off chance that it does, and if you plan to roll there, I would at least keep one Enisu to maybe use in the future. Cannon is an exchangeable unit who still sees use from time to time due to her Omnivoid active skill that has a sometimes useless gravity effect. She and her equip are pretty decent for farming with Rosetta teams. If you only have 1 or 2 copies, I would probably keep both. And if you don't have any, I might even decide to exchange for her, but only if you're summoning fodder, and you have looked at all other possible options. She does take GFEs as fodder, so you could use those instead of collab units. Some of the GungHo Collab 1 exchangeable units also take GFEs, and I know I barely mentioned them because the 6 Magic Stone machine is basically a scam. That being said, you might want to take a look at Zeta and Riser as they have interesting bases and equips. If you have a lot of fodder, I might take a look at them, especially Riser, since I think I've seen him being used in some ranking dungeons. But back to the GungHo Collab 2 exchangeables. All of the 9 stars take GungHo Collab 2 units as fodder, and out of these, I might take a close look at Lakshmi and Rudra due to their equips. Both can be of use, especially the second one, due to the 10C, Bulk, OE, and Haste active skill. Maybe even the base could be of use as a looping 40% shield, though I can't really think of a team that desperately needs this unit. Team of 6 young adults has an interesting equip, but the lack of bulk awakenings is a bit of a concern. Could have some interesting applications in some dungeons. This equip did see some use in some Sakamata teams that were used to quickly clear SN6. This wouldn't be a first priority, but it could have some niche application. Verne and Hibana and Shizune may be of use for some teams, but in the case of Verne, he just seems like a downgrade from Rengoku if you plan to use them in a Tanjiro or Nezuko team. Maybe there's a chance that a dark PvP team will show up in the near future that might want to have a unit like Hibana and Shizune, but that hasn't been the case yet, and by then, there probably will be a better option. I also like their Chibi Evo, but like many of the units here, I don't really see where to actually use them. Take Gossil for example. At the moment, there really isn't a Wood Skyfall team that would greatly benefit from this unit. Maybe that will change in the future, but like with Hibana and Shizune, I wouldn't bank on that happening and skip on these exchanges. Hazan and Varon are worth the look if you manage to get Niska, as they are very commonly found in those teams. The teams are a bit pricey to assemble since Niska is a BGM, and you might be unfortunately locked out of those teams if you didn't get Kaigaku from Demon Slayer. Before making the exchange for that light duo, check the description below for links to Niska teams to see if you can actually make a viable team. I know I just went through a bunch of units that are somewhat notable, but if push comes to shove, you might still want to use some of these units as Laufey fodder if you got Doma from Demon Slayer. If you're very desperate for fodder, I'll remind you that you might be able to roll fodder out of the ad machine. So in the worst case scenario, I would wait until the very last day of the event, roll the ad machine, and if you still don't have enough fodder, then maybe do a few rolls. For those without Doma, I feel like you can pretty much ignore this GungHo Collab rerun. I definitely recommend saving up for future events. And the most notable collab where some people might want to roll a lot in is Kaiju number 8. We have no idea if it'll actually come to NA. I usually say a bit more about future collabs and events, but I expect Halloween to start very soon, so I'll save those comments for that review video. That does it for this video. Please remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed it or found it helpful. Thank you guys for watching, and a special thanks go out to Ages number 1 and Awkward Panda, Breastfeeding Obama, Daniel, Dark Silencers, Doom Raccoon, Eddie Ryan, Exxon, Martini, Shady, and Wave for supporting the channel. I really appreciate it. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.